The Harlem Renaissance was a social movement that inspired and showcased the talents of many African Americans. It impacted all of America in ways that changed the course of life for Africans forever. It brought people of all color together and helped bring about a new era through the use of arts such as paintings and music. African Americans used the arts as a way to express how they felt toward racism and used it to fight against discrimination in a respectable manner. It all started with the Great Migration of the early 20th century, when hundreds of thousands of Black people migrated from the South to the North, where it presented more economic opportunities and a better life for Africans. This migration helped bring about some of the most talented minds of the 1920s, where it featured an array of African scholars to the brightest artists. A Harvard-educated writer named Alan Locke described this movement as a spiritual coming of age in which African Americans transformed social disillusionment to race pride. Race pride brought on by the various discriminations that Africans had to face on a daily basis. Discrimination from things such as the Jim Crow laws, which were a set of strict racial segregation laws that made African Americans second-class citizens, forcing them to a system devised to keep them poor and powerless. And the white supremacist hate group known as the Ku Klux Klan, where they committed lynchings and made campaigns of terror to prevent Africans from voting or being able to have fundamental rights. These incidents brought about a movement where African Americans expressed their anger and wants in art forms. More specifically, paintings and music were two of the most important aspects of the Renaissance movement. They had used intricate details in their paintings to provide a visual picture for white people to see what segregation was really like during the 19th century. Africans also used music lyrics to describe their lives and what it was like during that time, giving people an insight into what was actually the reality.
During the Harlem Renaissance, many artists wrote about how African Americans were treated. Many artists would do this through blues music. Blues music was more sorrow-sounding music that focused on lyrics. This made it ideal for blues artists to express their feelings about how they and their families were treated. These songs often became popular, so many people would hear the songs and their messages with it. This would in the end help fight racism through the arts such as music. An example of an artist using a blues song as a way to express the racism they had dealt with and to combat it is in the song Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. In this song, Holiday sings about the South. To be more specific, however, Holiday is singing about the lynchings in the South. She sings about strange fruit in the trees that bleed on the roots, referring to the blood that dripped from the hanging bodies. The song lyrics also claims that the southern trees that bared black bodies. The black bodies are referring to the African Americans who were the victims of the southern lynchings. Due to hate groups like the KKK and racism, the lynchings were more common in the South. During the Harlem Renaissance, many African Americans would use art such as music or paintings to express the hardships they had dealt with. The Harlem Renaissance was also a time for African Americans to make names for themselves. In doing so, many made their names through how they expressed their hardships of racism. Strange Fruit was one of the first songs with a message against racism to become popular during the 30s. Billie Holiday would perform it because she dealt with racism her whole life. Her father died when he didn't receive medical attention after exposure to mustard gas. The song helped gain a positive awareness on the negative things happening to people being treated poorly because of racism. Holiday made it her goal to fight racism, but not with violence, but through her songs. Strange Fruit had a big impact in the world fighting against racism.
The Harlem Renaissance was a time period of intellectual, social, and artistic explosion to showcase African American pride. The Harlem Renaissance represented, quote, a turning point in black cultural history. It helped African American writers and artists gain control over the representation of black culture and experience, and it provided them a place in Western high culture, end quote. which is why it was labeled as a new movement. Embracing art, music, and literature, they used their culture to break the stereotypes that have been put on them for their whole lives. During the Harlem Renaissance, African Americans used artwork to help redefine the black culture history. An artwork done by Archibald Motley shows how he's displaying African American culture. The scene takes place in a bar, showing everyone dancing to the jukebox. The artwork shows a new identity of their culture in which the American people and the whole world had a new understanding of their culture. Another piece of art done by Jacob Lawrence depicts the lives of African Americans migrating north. With all the hardships they had to face in their everyday life, this piece of art creates the image of their history and all the struggles they had to go through. In conclusion, artwork opened up a new door understanding the African American culture. Artwork was used to control the representation of their culture. The Harlem Renaissance set a new standard for African Americans, which helped set the stage for the civil rights movement.
The Harlem Renaissance was a movement in order to show society a different side of African American life. The Harlem Renaissance symbolized a rebirth of hope for African Americans, which was why it was named as a Renaissance. The music, sometimes referred to as jungle music, represented the blend of African American culture and modern day American culture as well. Jazz, which grew very popular in the Roaring Twenties, was a form of music that combined African rhythms, blues, and ragtime to produce a unique sound. Jazz, especially blues, had a major impact on society because it allowed for African Americans to express themselves in a way they had never been able to in the past. African Americans also gained a level of respect from the rest of society after a history of constant judgment and ridicule for their skin color. Jazz became the fuel for racial integration and the start of the civil rights movement. According to Michael Verity, a jazz musician and contributor to music articles and websites, the music, which appealed to whites and blacks alike, provided a culture in which the collective and the individual were in tricksite. It was a space where a person was judged by their ability alone and not by race or any other irrelevant factors. Therefore, this marked the beginning of an era where Americans began to look beyond skin color and instead at talent, character, represented through jazz music. Musicians like Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday, and Benny Goodman used their bands to express their civil liberties and their rights as citizens of the United States. Furthermore, jazz was not only used as a form of expression, but it was a forum on which all Americans could come together and make music, putting all judgment and prejudice aside. African Americans had faced many battles, whether it be racism, discrimination, or segregation, but they managed to find comfort and a sense of peace in the music. The reason that they were able to gain respect from white citizens was because they used their hardships to invent a new form of music. Although, contrary to popular belief, jazz does not owe its existence to any one race, because jazz was the blending of two cultures, European and African. According to Desert News, jazz was a unifying force of blacks and whites who lived their lives mostly as two separate nations within the United States. That being the case, it is almost as if jazz was a representation of their society. Classical and African American music started out separate due to the polarization of cultures, but as time went on, both blacks and whites began to make music together, which caused a blend of cultures shown through the music. Furthermore, jazz became a mirror of society. As the cultures would integrate through the country, so did the style and technicality of the music. Jazz became a common ground for all men and women, whether it was accepted by society or not. Not everyone agreed with the idea of making music together as black and white men, but jazz provided a rare, virtually underground passageway through which many young white musicians and white fans passed on their way to discovering the richness and shared common humanity of black culture. Despite what others at the time thought, music played a major role in the integration of African American culture into American society and camaraderie. In conclusion, jazz was the mixture of African American culture and background with modern day European and white culture in America. This music was a form of expression for those who faced racism and prejudice throughout their lives. It was a way for African Americans to prove themselves to society and force white Americans to look past their skin color. Jazz became an echo of society and made it possible for blacks and whites to come together as one. Thank you.